Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming here to spend the afternoon with Kaveh Akbar and I. And I want to take a minute to acknowledge Mark Sanders because this is our last event this year for us as a series. And it's the last time that Mark will be the director of IRR. He's stepping down at the end of this year. And he's really given us a home as a series and been incredibly supportive and just has attended all of our events. And he's such a dear friend, and it's a privilege to be your friend, but also to learn from him and just grow under his mentorship over the last few years. And I don't think our series would even be possible without his support. So, welcome. Yes, claps. And of course, as always, many thanks to Arya for everything she does to carry the series. We love you. So, welcome to the Initiative on Race and Resilience and to tonight's Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance event with Kaveh Akbar. I'd like to begin by thanking my collaborators and by acknowledging our generous sponsors. So, first, IRR, directed by Mark, and then the Institute for Social Concerns, the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, the MFA program in creative writing, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Graduate School Teaching Beyond the Classroom grants, the American Studies Department, the English Department, and the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters. I'd also like to thank Brookline Booksmith Transnational Literature Series in Boston for collaborating with us. So, welcome to all of you who are joining us online. As most of you probably already know, the aim of this series is to bring global Anglophone writers of the greater Middle East and North Africa together with American writers of color, and to spotlight books that address questions of exile and displacement. I'm grateful to Kaveh for accepting my invitation. Kaveh Akbar's poetry has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Paris Review, and Best American Poetry. He's the author of two poetry collections, Pilgrim Bell and Calling a Wolf, and a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. In 2024, his best-selling debut novel, Martyr, published by Knopf, was one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of the year, a Time must-read book of the year, and shortlisted for the National Book Award. Named Poetry Editor of the Nation in 2020, Kaveh has earned multiple Pushkright Prizes and Levi Reading Prize. Born in Tehran, he teaches at the University of Iowa in the MFA program and at Randolph College and Warren Wilson as well. So, Martyr, which many of you have read, is an intensely lyrical, kaleidoscopic novel of ideas that takes the reader on an unforgettable journey that is both geopolitical and metaphysical. The novel's protagonist, Sirus Shams, is born in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s and moves to Indiana with his father after his mother is killed while on board Iran Air Flight 655, which was downed by a U.S. missile cruiser in 1988. That's actually a historical fact. The novel opens with a scene in which the adult Sirus is lying supine on his mattress in his home in Indiana, his mind enveloped in the fog of alcohol, willing God to speak to him through the light bulb hanging from his ceiling. He is negotiating with God, with the unseen world, and this quest to fill the excruciating void of exile and unprocessed grief fuels the psychological and spiritual arc of the novel. Sirus becomes obsessed with martyrdom. Unable to inhabit his life or to extract any persuasive meaning from it, he begins to lust after a larger than life death, a death that is an antidote to the meaninglessness of his mother's death, who was obliterated into a statistic in the political face off between Iran and the US. We eventually follow Cyrus, newly sober, from Indiana to New York City, where he meets Orkide, an Iranian artist who's dying from cancer and spending the last of her days conducting a performance piece at the Brooklyn Museum. Orkide does exactly what Cyrus wishes he could do. She transforms her mortality into art by placing her impending death on view, and in the process becomes a witness to other people's angst, including Cyrus's, who goes to the museum day after day to speak with her until she passes away. The novel is polyphonic, told from the perspective of multiple characters: Cyrus's father, uncle, mother, the great Persian poet Ferdowsi, but Sirus remains the centrifugal force to which their narratives are attached. It is the very tug of their language that gives him the momentum he needs to carry himself from one moment to the next as he searches for clues that there might be some glory or even a nascent tenderness in the courage to say yes to life, that the emotional leap required to trust life after it has betrayed him might yield a much higher profit margin than the plot to devise an ingenious death. As I moved through the cyclone of voices that animate the novel, I felt as though I was walking from one room to another, not through doorways, but through a trap door or a window or a hidden staircase. I was in an altered spatial temporal dimension, one that in its non linearity captures the spiritual void of exile, of banishment, the long afterlife of silence the exile endures, cut off from the frequencies of their language. But exile is also an invitation to subterfuge, to reinvent oneself, to acquire a new language, a secondary self whose literacy does not always contain the vocabulary to address the ghosts that linger at the margins of the mother tongue, but which can nevertheless become an archaeological site one obsessively digs in an effort to find the original banished self. The language of the novel is, I believe, unabashedly lyrical and grand because the frontiers of English are being exploded in the search for home, self, and belonging. Because so much of the novel is about martyrs, and because of the decimating political circumstances we find ourselves in, I want to close my introduction with a poem by Mahmoud Darwish from the collection Victims of a Map. I was just at a tribute event in New York City, and my dear friend Amiel Alcalai read this poem out loud, and I just thought, what a lovely coincidence. The poem is called When the Martyrs Go to Sleep. When the martyrs go to sleep, I wake up to guard them against professional mourners. I say to them, I hope you wake in a country with clouds and trees, mirage and water. I congratulate them on their safety from the incredible event, from the surplus value of the slaughter. I steal time so they can snatch me from time. Are we all martyrs? I whisper, friends, leave one wall for the laundry line, leave a night for singing. I will hang your names wherever you want, to sleep a while, sleep on the ladder of the sour vine tree, so I can guard your dreams against the daggers of your guards and the plot of the book against the prophets. Be the song of those who have no songs when you go to sleep tonight. I say to you, I hope you wake in a country and pack it on a galloping mare. I whisper, friends, you'll never be like us, the rope of an unknown gallows. So I think just it's just so important to have the voice of Mahmoud Darwish in the room tonight and in just Palestinian voices in the air in general. Thank you so much, Kaveh for accepting our invitation, and please give a warm welcome to him.
Hi everybody. My name is Kaveh Akbar. My pronouns are he, him, or anything respectful. Thank you so much. That was incredible. I would like a copy of that so I can study it and read it more slowly. My brain, you were doing a lot of things at the frontiers of language there, to borrow a phrase of yours. Thank you, Rylan, was it? Mylan, shit, I'm so close. Thank you, Mylan. I appreciate it for making me sound cool. I didn't get your name, but thank you for doing that. Hi, virtual friends. Thank you all for being here. It's my luck to be here. I've been to Notre Dame a few times in my life, but never as a adult person who had people in a room to see me being here. So thank you for being here with me. I'm gonna just read very briefly from the book that I'm ostensibly gathered here to read, that you are all ostensibly gathered here to hear me read from, but I'm much more excited about talking to Azreen and talking to you all. So I'll just sort of put the book in the air and then we can talk to each other. Hey, welcome. Come on in. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Sincerely. This is really lucky. And thank you. I recognize some faces from the class that I visited this morning. I'm glad that you guys aren't sick of me. Also, my friend Kayla is here and I saw Gabby in the back. Y'all should go see Gabby after this. It's a very cool night of events that y'all have. All right. I'm gonna read now and stop talking. This is just you don't need to know anything. This is just the opening couple pages of Martyr. Cyrus Shams. Maybe it was that Cyrus had done the wrong drugs in the right order, or the right drugs in the wrong order. But when God finally spoke back to him after 27 years of silence, what Cyrus wanted more than anything else was a do over, clarification. Lying on his mattress that smelled like piss and Febreze, in his bedroom that smelled like piss and Febreze, Cyrus stared up at the room's single light bulb, willing it to blink again, willing God to confirm that the bulb's flicker had been a divine action and not just the old apartment's trashy wiring. Flash it on and off, Cyrus had been thinking, not for the first time in his life. Just a little wink and I'll sell all my shit and buy a camel. I'll start over. All his shit at that moment amounted to a pile of soiled laundry and a stack of books borrowed from various libraries and never returned. Poetry and biographies, To the Lighthouse, My Uncle Napoleon. Never mind all that, though. Cyrus meant it. Why should the Prophet Muhammad get a whole visit from an archangel? Why should Saul get to see the literal light of heaven on the road to Damascus? Of course, it would be easy to establish bedrock faith after such clear cut revelation. How was it fair to celebrate those guys for faith that wasn't faith at all, that was just obedience to what they plainly observed to be true? In what sense did it make to punish the rest of humanity, who had never been privy to such explicit revelation? To make everyone else lurch from crisis to crisis, desperately alone. But then it happened for Cyrus, too, right there in that ratty Indiana bedroom. He asked God to reveal himself, herself, themself, itself, whatever. He asked with all the earnestness at his disposal, which was troves. If every relationship was a series of advances and retreats, Cyrus was almost never the retreater, sharing everything important about himself at a word, a smile, with a shrug as if to say, those are just facts. Why should I be ashamed? He'd lain there on the bare mattress on the hardwood floor, letting his cigarette ash on his bare stomach like some sulky prince, thinking, turn the lights on and off, Lord, and I'll buy a donkey. I promise I'll buy a camel and ride him to Medina, to Gethsemane, wherever. Just flash the lights and I'll figure it out. I promise. He was thinking this, and then something happened. The light bulb flickered, or maybe it got brighter, like a camera's flash going off across the street. Just a fraction of a second like that. And then it was back to normal, just a regular yellow bulb. Cyrus tried to recount the drugs he'd done that day. The standard bouquet of booze, weed, cigarettes, Klonopin, Adderall. He had a couple Percocets left, but he'd been saving them for later that evening. None of what he'd taken was exotic, nothing that would make him out and out hallucinate. He felt pretty sober, in fact, relative to his baseline. He wondered if it had maybe been the sheer weight of his wanting, or his watching, that strained his eyes till they saw what they'd wanted to see. He wondered if maybe that was how God worked now in the new world. Tired of interventionist pyrotechnics like burning bushes and locust plagues, maybe God now worked through the tired eyes of drunk Iranians in the American Midwest, through CVS handles of bourbon and little pink pills with G31 written on their side. Cyrus took a pull from the giant plastic Old Crow bottle. The whiskey did, for him, what a bedside table did for normal people. It was always at the head of his mattress, holding what was essential to him in place. It lifted him daily from the same sleep it eventually set him into. Lying there, reflecting on the possible miracle he'd just experienced, Cyrus asked God to do it again. Confirmation, like typing your password in twice to a web browser. Surely, if the all knowing creator of the universe had wanted to reveal themselves to Cyrus, there'd be no ambiguity. Cyrus stared at the ceiling light, which in the fog of his cigarette smoke looked like a watery moon, and waited for it to happen again. But it didn't. Whatever sliver of a flicker he had or hadn't perceived didn't come back. And so, lying there in the stuffy haze of relative sobriety, itself a kind of high, amidst the underwear and cans and dried piss and empty orange pill bottles and half read books held open against the hardwood, breaking their spines to face away, Cyrus had a decision to make.
These mics are on? Okay, great. Thank you, Kaveh. So I usually begin these conversations by, because we're dealing with people who are writing in English but thinking or feeling in other languages, by asking, I'd love to ask you about the English language and the ways in which you manipulate it so that Farsi words and idioms, as well as Iranian affect, can pierce through the surface. And I guess if you can just talk about how you relate the two languages ideologically and effectively in your work at large.
Ideologically and effectively. Can you guys hear me? Is my loopity blorping? Beep, boop, boop, beep, boop, boop. Okay, cool. Yeah? Yeah? Is kind of can I
Maybe we can raise the volume a little bit.
sorry, thank you, good friend. Yeah, oh, that's I feel so much more durable. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'm also self-conscious that I'm drinking right now. I know it's Ramadan. I'm usually fasting for there's like one auntie in the audience somewhere that I can't see who's like, "Why is he drinking right now?" But I'm traveling and I'm kind of a little under the weather, so please, I'll make it up. I promise. Yeah, I'm fascinated by the inefficiency of English. I think it's a really good playground as an artist. I think it's a really good, I mean, I think that we are, we're working in a medium that comes from so many different tributaries. It's evolved so inefficiently and so irregularly that the construction of an English sentence is just so contrary to any sort of like system. It's just it's such a unique language. And I mean, like I could say, Johannes, I'm cold, may I please borrow your jacket there? Or I could say like cold, right? And they're both semantically relaying the same data, right? But like one, or roughly the same data, but one is so much more inefficient than the other one, right? And so I get, as an English language artist, what sounds pretentious, but I think highlights the materiality of the language in a way that feels exciting and true to me, in the same way that like a statuary artist works with statues or bronze or whatever, or like a painter works with paint, right? Like
Mhm.
I like the foregrounding of the medium in that way, calling myself a language artist, though I also hear it as being kind of insufferably pretentious. So I say it in like sort of affable faced crowds like this and not onto the record. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that being able to look into any sort of room from the outside gives you a vantage point to a kind of perspective that you don't get when you're sitting in the room, right?
Mm.
I think that when your nose is pressed up to the mural, it's hard to make out what's going on when and so in a room full of Iranian people, I always feel like the least Iranian person. In a room full of Americans, I've certainly never felt particularly American. And so it can be psycho-spiritually corrosive and has been at various, significant terminals in my personal growth, but is also creatively advantageous, right?
Mhm.
Being able to step back from the language and recognize these inefficiencies. And I mean, like, this, like, if I in Farsi, if you want to say like I miss you, you could say "Dilam barat teng shode," right?
Mm.
Which is, I mean, colloquially, it's like I miss you, right? But what it literally translates to, the language is like my heart tightens for you, right? If I translate that, and if I'm translating that from the Farsi into English, and I say my heart tightens for you, suddenly it's become like weirdly baroque and sort of lyrical and sort of flowery, florid in a way that it doesn't sound in the Farsi. Like it's not this like big, you know, pronouncement, fancy sounding pronouncement, it's just like, I miss you. But if I just translate it as I miss you, you're losing the heart, right? You're losing the tightness, right? Both translations are wrong, right? And there's no middle ground. You can't say my heart tightens, miss you, or what, you know what I mean? Like there's no sort of compromise between the two. So you at some point have to choose. And I feel like that is a delicious little synecdoche for the use of language to articulate experience or consciousness at all, right? The idea that inevitably, um, there's going to be a delta. I mean, this is, everyone in this room knows about like signs and signify, but like there's going to be a delta between the thing that is coming out of my mouth and the object or sensation or experience that I'm trying to apply language to. And I think that I like my native idiom is to Whitmanian and just sort of like throw flour on the ghost of a thought. And just like if I sufficiently, dust the thought with enough yopping, I'll eventually kind of give it shape. But my favorite authors tend to be the Dickinsonians who, like the Jean Valentine poem that we read earlier in the class. My favorite authors tend to be those who use the silence as the subject of the poem and then the language as a kind of mold to pour around the silence.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, Farsi is such a emotionally dramatic language, and
It's so
there's
thespian. It's like being like a perpetual theater kid.
yeah, yeah, I mean, I always joke that, like, my mom says this to me, and she used to my brother too, but all the time about, she sees you walking across the room to go get a cup of coffee, and she's like, "Korbunet beram," which actually means I would sacrifice myself for you, and I'm
Yeah.
like, "This is not helping."
Yeah, yeah.
To
It
hear
ties
that
into
your
the
mother,
martyrdom. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's like the subject of, like, sacrifices, and yeah, martyrdom and the ways in which expressions of martyrdom are deeply gendered in our
Yeah.
culture. But I did think that, the kind of
Uh,
metaphorical turns of
wait, wait, wait. Sorry.
yeah.
You're talking faster than my brain's moving. The expressions of, wait, so you're saying like your mother saying that is like her own sacrificing her own
I
martyr.
think that yeah, so, like, the sort of well, we can talk about martyrdom more in depth. I wanna get to that with the Iran-Iraq War and the specific ways in which male martyrdom and the murals in Tehran, which I wanted to show images of, but then I thought twice about it. Sort of during the Iran-Iraq War, people went to the front, all ages, from, like, 14 all the way to their 70s, and their deaths were really celebrated. A lot of the streets, the literal topography of the city, the urban landscape changed because all of the street names were renamed after certain martyrs. And the basically it's a kind of like you die, you sacrifice your individuality in order to become part of a collective symbol, which is tied up with, anti-American sentiment and also a kind of revitalization of the Islamic discourse and theology as part of the government. And, the murals were everywhere. This was the first experience of art that I had when we first returned there as children.
Huh.
And they have, like, these pastel colors, and everybody's head is floating like, the sky, and there's, like, doves and pigeons and wheat everywhere. They're actually, beautiful, but then you'll see, like, other murals which will be, like, skulls and the American flag, and it's like, "Down with America."
Mm.
And they're in conversation with one another, right? These murals across the city, but I think women in particular are encouraged to really sacrifice themselves as the mothers, and especially the
Mhm.
mothers of the martyrs,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
who
yeah,
were congratulated for their son's death.
yeah, yeah,
So, these are just like two archetypes, right? Like when we talk about Iran, I always feel deeply protective, and I want to be like, these are not the only archetypes or the only expressions of Iranianness. They're just two, right?
and it's also true that, like, when we talk about the Iranian cultural veneration and political veneration of martyrdom writ large, it sounds very sort of exotic and oriental, but we do the same thing here. We have, like, this sort of in Iran, the regime is this kind of necro-Islamic regime that, has hijacked the language of martyrdom, which is deeply intertwined with Shia Islam, right? Like the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, is a huge event. The Battle of Karbala in AD 655 is this huge event in Shia Islam, like a sort of, well, I don't want to compare it, but but it's this huge event, right? And it's every year in Iran we have Ashura, right?
Mm.
Which is the day that of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. Everyone wears black, and there are images of people self-flagellating in the streets, and but even we as a fairly secular family in the American Midwest would like wear black and not watch TV, on Ashura, and there's the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, the son-in-law of the prophet. I mean, like there's this deep religious tenor that has become a cultural tenor in Iran over the years that then the government hijacks and makes into this political tenor by, in the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s, calling the soldiers who died martyrs. The Iran-Iraq War was the first war since World War I to use human wave attacks, which is to say, when there was a field of landmines, the Iranian army and the Iraqi army would send just a just a wave of soldiers to clear the landmines with their bodies, as opposed to laboriously clearing them out. It was the first war since World War I to use chlorine gas and mustard gas. So, like, even by war standards, was this pretty was this pretty savage. And one of the ways that the Iranian regime mitigated that savagery was by creating this sort of cultural veneration, saying these soldiers who are dying, we're going to hang their pictures in the mosques, and we're going to, give them special cemeteries where we'll hire poets to, read poetry at their graves, right? And then you think about, like, I mean, I was writing this book about martyrdom writ large, largely during the quarantine, when in America, our own sort of like necro-capitalist regime was saying things like, we thank our essential workers for their sacrifice, right? Like essentially sort of like, lubricating our gullets. I don't know what this metaphor is, but essentially just sort of paving the way for our acceptance of their inevitable, or what would seem inevitable, demise, though, it was an organic pathogen exacerbated by myriad systemic and political factors that fractured its effects along socioeconomic and racial lines, right? And in order to obfuscate that, our regime was saying the exact same things, right? Just instead of wrapping it in the language of Islam, it was wrapping it in the language of sort of secular capitalism, right?
Mhm.
Like we thank our essential workers, right? It is, and that was, I think, more than anything, one of the sort of like animating rages. And again, when I say rage, I mean the kind of rage that emerges from a surfeit of compassion, a rage that emerges from an ability to perceive the interiority of the harmed, and to perceive the harmed as having an interior life as vital and complex as my own, and a heart that could fit in my chest, and etc. But that was one of the animating rages that catalyzed the writing of this book. Was I was just, the way that people talked about, Iran and their barbarisms my whole life, and the way that people talk about that part of the world, and then seeing the exact same shit happening here, but it being wrapped in this language of sort of like secular capitalism. And so everyone was like banging their pots and pans for nurses and stuff, you know what I mean? And we were like celebrating and liking these videos and stuff. And it just felt like this eerie symmetry to me. And I felt like I was going insane because no one was being like, this is a eerie bad symmetry.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the history of propaganda on both sides, right, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, even with the language of the axis of evil and, we're gonna smoke them all out of their holes,
Yeah.
and it's just there's a lot of you kn it's just it's such a painful thing, really, but, I mean, the Middle East has become like the US's backyard, and they do with it what they want, and for generations, the region is gonna be decimated. I mean, there's like, I could weep my whole lifetime because of this. But I did wanna kinda linger a little bit in the question of language, because I think in the novel, there's all these, like, moments of there's a lot of metaphors that felt to me, like, very much affectively Iranian in the high melodrama of the emotion
Mm.
and the way that the sentences are sort of, like, moving o on the page and moving us through, we're the way that we're being asked to move through the novel with these, like, haunted, spectral voices coming at us, and, almost like a I don't know, they felt like shrapnel to my consciousness, but I think, like, it's interesting to think about Farsi and English together because they're so diametrically opposed linguistically. English is such a to me, I think, simple, straightforward language like subject, verb, object, but that's what makes it so grammatically pliable. Like you can pull it apart and do all kinds of experiments on it. But I think it's interesting from an ideological perspective because it is the language of empire and it's the language that is also used to, like, violate our personhood, right, as peoples of the Middle East, of the
Mm.
region, and then to be writing in it and experimenting with it, manipulating it. You know, I have a whole range of emotions, like, I sometimes feel like it's like a defeat to be writing in English, other times I feel like, "Screw this, I'm gonna dominate this language," you know, like,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
so, you know, I just was curious about and we can keep talking about it, but maybe I'll pose a second question that I can add to this sort of parallel of like Iran and the US. So we know Cyrus is obsessed with death and early on in the book he has a job where he's play acting. He's like a dying patient in a hospital helping doctors practice their bedside manners and he's you write play acting at dying. He pretended to be one of those who perish. He liked how the Quran put it that way. Not until you die, but until you are of those who perish. Until you are of those who perish. I find something really comforting in that line. There's a quality of ongoingness about death in the Islamic tradition.
Mhm.
And Sirus specifically says that he's not talking about death in the Sylvia Plath sense of the word. So, can you talk a little bit about the
Mm.
nuances of that distinction?
I love that. Yeah, that's a cool thing that you zoomed in on. I mean, I that ongoingness, that entry into a club, you know, those who have perished, right, implies what feels to me to be a very Islamic view of death, which is to say that, you know, I am here in front of you all on a 5-minute bus ride in between two infinities, right? And this bus ride, you know, the idea that I should be complaining about the windows being down and the breeze being too breezy on my face or, you know, the bus being too cramped or whatever is so sort of laughably superfluous because, you know, the eclipsing magnitude of these two eternities just makes, you know, is always foregrounded in one's consciousness. But, you know, the idea that you get to be entered into the array of those who perish. Yeah, I don't know. I find that very comforting. I mean, I think one of the sort of baffling things is that about being alive is that we're not all talking about that all the time, right? You know, the idea that we're all sort of hurtling towards an infinity from an infinity that nobody has ever reported back. Well, uh, maybe. I mean, depending on your sort of theological loadout, very few have ever reported back from. Very few to none have ever reported back from. Or I guess everyone, depending on certain, like, there are certain Vedic traditions. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. How are we, like, why are we here talking about a book that you know, like my arrangement of these 26 runes on some dead bark, you know, instead of talking about that thing. And a lot of you are ostensibly gathered here at a religious university to talk about that thing, which I think is cool. I mean, I did while I was working on this, while I was working on Martyr, I also did the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse, 110 poets on the divine. It's had like a 12,000 titles in its various and sundry iterations. But so I was reading a lot of poetry from, you know, Sufi mystics and Aboriginal Antipodean poets and indigenous Mesoamerican poets and thinking a lot about what Mahadevyaka had to say about things and Li Po and you know, there's no way for me one of my favorite writers is the Argentinian short story writer, well, he was a poet too, but I like his short stories more than I like his poetry, Jorge Luis Borges, Borges, and he was famously upset. This is maybe a funny voice to be bringing up because he was definitely a bit of an Orientalist, but I think that you and I are allowed to forgive him for that.
I think
Um,
we can officially forgive him.
yeah, I think that that's how that
He earned
works.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, he, he has this great essay where he talks about how the writers in Argentina should learn from Muhammad because he calls the Quran, like the Arabic book par excellence is his language. because in the Quran there is no camels. He says there are no camels in the Quran, and that proves its authenticity because if there were an outsider, if there were a tourist, writing about the Arab world, they would be filling it with camels, right? That would be what is aberrant, right? It's like what was that bad book that everyone got mad at? American Dirt, right? Where
Oh,
she was
yeah.
like italicizing burrito or whatever, like and like that idea of the authenticity being that you don't have to remark upon what would be, and you don't have to sort of italicized camel or whatever. And he's like, and the writers in Buenos Aires could learn a lot from this instead of always trying to. And this is remarkable for two things. One, I think it's like a beautiful, valid point that, people should not try to sort of like fetishize their own cultures or orientalize themselves. But also, there are camels everywhere in the Quran. Like, there are a ton of camels in the Quran. And so, like, Borges had just like obviously read like a part of the Quran, which was more than like the people that he was talking to had read because nobody challenged him on it, right? But the part that I was actually wait, why did I start? Oh, yeah, yeah. So late in his life, or his actually, so a lot of, if you've read him, a lot of his writing, like the Book of Sand or the Library of Babel, a lot of his writing orbits various approximations of infinity. He was really interested in these ideas of infinity. And late in his life, he actually, one of his favorite approximations was the Sahara Desert. Again, bit of an Orientalist. We're allowed to forgive him. We're all ethically mature enough to take what we need and leave the rest. But he was really obsessed with the Sahara Desert and like imagining the various and sundry grains of sand in the desert as, and actually, a grain of sand to the relative to the Sahara Desert is infinitely bigger than we are to infinity. But as an approximation that the human mind can apprehend, it was useful to him, and he wrote a lot about it. And late in his life, he actually gets to go to the Sahara Desert. They take him there, and when he lands, they take him out to the desert itself, and they take him out there. And this is like, I think he's already blind at this point, or he's
Oh, Lord.
going blind. And they take him out to the desert, and he reaches down and scoops up a palmful of sand and lets it drift through his fingers, and he says, "I am modifying the Sahara."
Mm.
Right? And that's his great epiphany. That's his big epiphany, right? Like his being there has inexorably, indelibly altered the topography of the Sahara, right? And I think that way about writing, about reading, about our being here, right? Like we're modifying each other's Saharas right now, right? Like every book I've ever read has modified my psychic Sahara and so, and it's like eating, right? Like I can't point to the part of my body where the Burmese food that I had 2 nights ago in San Francisco is living, right? Like, I mean, the plata that I had is, like, in here somewhere, like, the lipids in that are in here somewhere doing lipid stuff, right? But, like, I can't point to them, and in the same way, right? Like, I can't point to the Borges part of my language brain or the Nabokov part or you know what I mean? Like, it's
Mhm.
just but I know that it's all in there
Yeah.
doing its work.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's a good segue to what I was gonna ask next, which is I mean, the book is sort of announces itself as a book that's a quest, about understanding martyrdom, but I think it's really b for me, like, the emotional core that propels the novel is really an obsession with figuring out how to, like, relate to divinity, and to
Mm,
the divine. You have the epigraph by Lispector, "Oh God, I just remembered that we die," and then the epigraph is completed at the end of the
mhm,
novel about, "Well, but in the meantime, the strawberries are in season,"
mhm,
which is sort of like talking about this in-betweenness that you're talking about of, like, how are we alive to ourselves and to each other while we're here?
yeah, 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 yeah,
And I think, like,
beautiful way to say that.
like, there's a great line from Sufi poetry that Sirus thinks about. It goes like this, "Lord, increase my bewilderment." And it made me think I've been sort of learning how to pray again. I sort of, like, divorced God for a long time, and
Huh,
now I'm finding my way back to an organizing force in the universe.
mhm,
But one of the lines that I've come across that have been really wonderful is, like, I think it goes like this, like, "I believe, God, I believe, heal my unbelief." So
huh,
it's like
huh,
declaring belief and unbelief in the same sentence, and it's like your unbelief is something you have to be healed from in the same sense that if you're no longer awed or bewildered by life, then, you're sort of like forgetting how to be inside of life. And I found that Cyrus in so many ways like is bewildered by his own identity, the way it exceeds the boundaries of what a cleanly packaged self should look like in the American imaginary.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to read this quote that I think captures that really well, if I can find it. It felt like the only time Cyrus ever really felt nowness was when he was using, when now was physiologically, chemically discernible from before. Otherwise, he felt completely awash in time, stuck between birth and death, an interval where he'd never quite gotten his footing. But he was also awash in the world and its checkboxes, neither Iranian nor American, neither Muslim nor not Muslim, neither drunk nor in meaningful recovery, neither gay nor straight. Each camp thought he was too much of the other thing. That there were camps at all made his head swim. Yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't know what my question is there, but maybe we can just like pontificate about all of that and just sort of his search to accommodate his own consciousness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that sense of having been precedented is something that I really only find in literature, right? Like, there's not a person walking around. When I was little, I used to listen to sad music when I was sad. And I
Mhm.
used to think that this was some inherent masochistic streak in me,
Very
like,
Iranian of
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. But it's like, I think it would stand to reason that when one is sad, one would want to alleviate that sadness by listening to, like,
No, you have to go
Weird
deeper,
Al or
deeper
whatever.
into the
Yeah. But I
sadness.
mean, I think that that instinct is to like listen to someone else say, I too have been sad and I live to sing about it, right? Here I am singing about it or through it. Yeah, the taxonomical designations that one can apply to oneself, I think, can be useful in terms of finding precedent in community. But because, again, I've never felt particularly well suited for any of those taxonomical designations, except for addict, for which is a category for which I qualify with abundance and very, very unambiguously. None of the other categories have ever felt particularly useful for me in that way, which is not to deny them their utility in the lives of others, right? But it's just, again, if I tell you that I'm Persian, you start speaking to me in Farsi and my eyes go big and I can make out every fifth word and then I have to explain to you that, you know what I mean? Like, or if I don't know, like, it's just if I tell you that I'm Muslim, you ask me about the masjid that I go to and I talk to you about how I think of Islam as a kind of hyper unmediated relationship between an individual and their higher power. And, you were talking about reacquainting yourself with prayer, and prayer is a part of my life as well. Some days I start every morning in prayer. Some days it's as simple as saying, lead me where you need me and show me thy will in ways I cannot possibly misunderstand, which I think is a nice way to invite not me into my head before the me that had me, you know, uh, nearly dying. And I used to sell drugs and I was really bad at it because I was too nice. So I'd be like, let yourself in. I'll be over in 20 minutes. So I'd get like robbed and burgled a lot. And so I was living in conditions that were not necessarily super conducive to the maintenance of any kind of homeostatic equilibrium. Yeah. And so, I mean, I don't know, but I also think that, like, again, prayer is this thing that we feel, or I don't know, I'm speaking in the first person plural. Prayer is this thing that I have felt the need to have a lot of certainty around in my life. And I think that I've come to a place with it in my own experience where I've sort of embraced that it's not really any of my business who, if anything, is on the other end of the prayer, and that it's not really how prayer works for me. If I say, lead me where you need me and show me thy will in ways I cannot possibly misunderstand. Or if I say, you know, make me an instrument of thy peace. Or if I say, some the I'm using prayers with which you guys might be a little bit more familiar. If I say, I offer myself to thee to take away my difficulties and that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help, right? Not to take away my difficulties that everyone might see how great I'm doing and that, everyone may bow before the awesome power of my will, but that I might be of service, right? My spouse and I are assiduous recyclers. I had a friend come over we were like rinsing out some cat tins while a friend was in our living room the other day and they were like, they all end up at the same landfill and it's like, yeah, I have the same Google that you have. Like like I've read the same articles and I know that it all ends, but the act of rinsing out every tin is reminding me that I am connected to a system larger than myself and that my presence has weight on the planet and makes me more mindful of that in my living, right? It is not about melting down that tin to make another tin. It is about the way that I carry myself in the world. And that is, I think recycling for us is an instance of a sort of secular prayer. I think when I sit down to write a poem, say for the unhoused in my community, I don't write the poem for the unhoused in my community and say, oh, job's done, wrote them a poem, bet they're going to be fine now. I write the poem and then, I go get socks and Cliff Bars and maxi pads and I take them to the mission. And that is how poetry works in my life, right? Like the poetry points me to the action. It doesn't supplant the action. And in the same way, prayer, if I pray for my mother in the morning, I don't say, but she's fine. You know what I mean? Like I pray for my mom and then I remember to call my mom later in the day and give her the reps that will keep her, the mental reps that will keep her. Teresa of Avila said, God has no hands but ours, right? I can't improve upon that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like her work. Yeah, I can somebody tell me what time it is? 6:21, 6:21. Okay, we wanna move to audience Q&A soonish. I have so many questions left.
We're going to dinner too.
Yeah, exactly, and I want the audience to I'm not gonna ask you questions about your novel at dinner. I'll let you be a regular human. But one of the things that I thought was really wonderful at the end of the book is all of the different things that art becomes, right? It becomes lifeboat, it becomes a way to communicate with the abyss. It becomes a way to learn to love passionately. It becomes a sanctuary. And I guess I'm speaking for myself as a writer. I think writing is also a way to play at dying. So I think of art writing particularly as a practice of martyrdom, not in the big martyrdom, capital M kind of sense, but in the sense that you have to be willing to die on the page and sort of tap into parts of your consciousness that might be bigger or higher or more connected than your sort of the self with which you move through the world. So I was just wondering if you would think of the book of sort of the language and art making in language in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that my when I got my first box of the books at my house, the dominant sensation somatically was a feeling of being less afraid to die, which I think had less to do with having made this thing, but more to do with just that it was final enough that not no one could take it away. It was like this no takes backsies permanence to
Mhm.
it, and like not even I could fuck it up, like not even I could, relapse my way into taking it away from me. And so there is that sense. I don't know. I mean, I'm reverent of the idea of participating in a conversation that has preceded me by millennia and will continue long after the last person has forgotten my name. And I think that there is a kind of liberating smallness in that, right?
Mhm.
That allows me to write about the things that I want to write. This is a book about martyrdom in Iran and Iran Air Flight 655, but it's also a book about Sonic Youth and Lisa Simpson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and I think that the Venn diagram or the intersection of the Venn diagram of those interests is like exactly one person and you're looking, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? And it feels good to be able to try to the poet Leon Lee says syntax is identity, right? Meaning that the way that language moves through us, then comes out of us, is indelibly inflected by all of our histories and genealogies and geographies and every book that we've read in the order that we read them and every movie that we've seen in the order that we've seen it. And it feels, I mean, I joked with my spouse when this came out that they could dump the text of the 85,000 words of this book into a sufficiently intelligent AI and just hang out with that after I died, right? Like, because for real, like, I really feel like it's like, I mean, it would be like 85% the sensation of hanging out with me. You know what I mean? Like, I really do genuinely, I mean, I genuinely believe that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like every book we write, we're rearranging our syntax in a sense, right? Like our consciousness is transformed
Uh huh.
by the work that we write.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like, if I was as smart as that book, I would have dictated that book. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's like
Like,
coming from
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
and like, you know, I know how repellent it is to say words like the muse or the unconscious or whatever, but like, it is objectively, empirically true that I am not as smart as that book, right? I could not just turn on my voice notes app and dictate a book like that, right? So there's something happening, right? Like whether you want to call it the unconscious, whether you want to call it training of the instincts, whatever you want to call that thing that that allows not me to not my intelligence.
Mhm.
There is something that happens when I write a poem or when I write prose that allows not me to inflect the way language happens.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll say this before we turn to audience questions. Like, I think one of the other aspects of the book that I really was taken by it was the intertextuality of the book, in the sense that there's like the book of martyrs inside the book.
Mhm.
And then there's also, at many points, like Cyrus talks about, "Oh, I'll put this in my book," or
Mhm. Mhm.
so he's referring to the book. So the book kind of keeps folding over itself, like, in this really interesting way. And structurally, it's also very sort of fluid. I don't know if you've seen any Giovanni Piranesi etchings. I'm sure
I
you've
don't
seen them, but you maybe
Yeah, I
don't
don't know the
remember.
name, sorry.
But he basically like has real and imagined architectures, Roman architectures, like superimposed on each other, and
Huh.
they're very sort of like gritty and atmospheric and fantastical. And I felt like that's it was sort of atmospherically reminded me of that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the martyr poems in the
Thank
text.
you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
There was a review. I read all my reviews exactly once, and there was a review, a very, very nice review. It was like a glowing review, actually. But in it, she was like, and you can, and it was the one review that talked about the poems, and she was like, and these poems are, she looked at some of my actual or my published books of poems, and she was like, and Kaveh's poems are good because of this, and these poems in the book he like very, very brilliantly made bad because of this to show this deficiency in Cyrus. And I was like, I tried really hard on those poems. You know what I mean? Like I didn't try to make them bad at all. I thought those
Yeah.
poems slap. You know what I mean? So
I thought they were great.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but just this sort of like rooms inside of rooms, this kind of structure of the novel. Maybe others can ask questions about that and like the process of writing the book or editorial feedback. So I just want to open it up to the audience. I'm sure Kaveh will be
Hey,
happy to take
what's
any
your name?
questions.
Mary Grace, like with a hyphen. Wow, cool. Nice to meet you, Mary Grace. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, they're too like, good name, good concept, 100%.
I'm curious about how you think of martyrdom and legacy as
Hmm,
being related. I find it really interesting because those two concepts are really like close together in my mind, but the word legacy doesn't appear in this book at all.
hmm.
So I'm curious as to how legacy figures into the way you think about martyrdom and also to the extent to which it's different the way sorry about martyrdom.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, so if you didn't hear it, Mary Grace's question was about my thoughts
martyrdom and the word legacy, the former appearing frequently in the book, the latter, I think, not appearing at all, which I think is right. It's one of those funny things where you can hit Control F on a manuscript and really scare yourself, because you realize that you have certain twitches as a writer and stuff. But oh, did you really? Oh, you really did search. Yeah. I was like, I'm trying to think. I don't think I ever say legacy. Yeah. It's interesting because I think maybe part of the argument of the book is to narrow the delta between the two concepts, or to say that um you know how, like, in well, are you a writer?
A little bit,
So
actually.
like in American poetry, in contemporary American poetry, people are very attached to the idea that anything that has 14 lines is a sonnet, and that the definitive characteristic of a sonnet is that it has 14 lines, and everything else, I mean, the sonnet is like a Italian parlor game, you know what I mean? Like there's no you could be as attached to, the Petrarchan rhyme scheme, or you could be as attached to the Volta, right? But for whatever reason, contemporary American poetry says that it's the 14 lines, and which is fine. I mean, I'm not offended by anyone calling anything really, but well, I mean, say nice things about things, but like, I'm not offended by anyone calling a thing a sonnet, but it is interesting to me sometimes that, like, yeah, I don't know, like, if I hit enter on a poem that has 13 lines in the middle of a line, I make it a sonnet, right? And if you instead think of the character, I promise I'm gonna land this point. But instead, if you think of the definitive characteristic of the sonnet being the volta or the turn, right? Then just about any contemporary lyric poem becomes a sonnet, right? Instead of this sort of s fairly arbitrary quantitative, you know, rubric, right? And in the same way, martyrdom, I think probably most would say that the definitive characteristic of martyrdom is the death of the martyr, right? And I think part of the argument that the book is making is that maybe one could extend that definition, right? And that not necessarily be the sort of definitive heuristic, or that there are alternatives available. I mean, I don't know if you've read the book, but those of you who have, there's an uncle in the book, there's a father in the book, there's, the uncle is very much still alive, but I think the book argues might rightly be considered a martyr, right? And so if one removes the sort of, the mortal terminus as the definitive characteristic of the martyr, and instead allows something a little bit more miasmic, then it begins to look a lot like legacy, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Hey, what's your name? Jake. Jake? It's nice to meet you. I'm Kaveh.
Oh, thank you.
Wow.
Okay, will do.
Thank you. I
Um,
appreciate you.
yeah, thanks for coming for this talk. This has been really cool. Something that I think kind of doesn't get a lot of play when we talk about this book. It's obviously a book about martyrdom, but Cyrus is also someone in recovery.
Yeah.
And I found that aspect of the novel really fascinating, that he's so caught up with this idea of martyrdom, but to choose to be in recovery is you're seeking a way back into life in a way. It's almost like the opposite of martyrdom in a sense.
Mm.
Thank you. And he also has this injury in his foot that's kind of a minor theme in the book. And I found this idea of like the corporeality, or like the embodiment of these things, really interesting. And by the end of the book, that actually ends up being the way, I like the way you talked about like the being connected between two eternities. It's almost how he accesses that in a way. And there's also an interesting interplay between, in the American context, addiction's very bad, but there's a long history of Sufism,
Sure.
of substance use as a way to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
access that.
Sadi and Hafez and
And
Rumi and all your favorite Sufi
yeah,
mystics are
yeah,
drunk
yeah.
as fuck.
And
Yeah,
so
and so
I
was Li Po. Like
yeah,
the apocryphally, Li Po died by drunkenly out on his boat. He saw his reflection in the water and dove in
yeah,
after himself.
yeah. And so to make a long question short, I'm really interested in your thoughts of how we can connect these ideas of like corporeality and like the limits of what we can do as humans who live in bodies, and in accessing the divine, and how you kind of played with that
Yeah,
interplay
that's
throughout the
such a
novel.
beautiful question. I love that. Yeah, I mean, like, Yeats talks about us all. This is the second time today I'm quoting Yeats. I'm just on this kick, but Yeats talks about us all being these beautiful immortal souls fastened to dying animals, right? And that is the tension, right? That is fundamentally the crisis of consciousness, right? Is that just as we start to figure stuff out, time's up, right?
and it's followed either by an eternity of nothingness or an eternity of somethingness, and we can't really agree on which is scarier. And yeah, I mean, that said, this is the text that we all have in common, right? This is the text, right? Like if I said, there are certain ideas and certain images that are so mitochondrial and essential to our like lizard brain understanding of being alive, right? Like if that window popped open and like a bunch of snakes flew in, like slithered in through the window, right? Probably most of us would run out of the room, right? Despite the fact that intellectually, like we see that we're in a room surrounded by electronics and wires and lights, and we intellectually are aware that in America, many orders of magnitude more people die from electrocution and fire than from snakes, right? But electrocution and fire have been around for an evolutionarily insignificant amount of time, and so our brains don't know to react to that reflexively the way that our brains know to react to the snake window. I say this to say there are ideas, there are images that are totemic, right? There's a reason that poets since time immemorial have spoken in these monolithic monosyllables, like these stone bone, like the Enheduanna, who's the earliest attributable author of our species, who I've also spoken about today. So it's like her and Yeats for me going head to head. But Enheduanna, a lot of the translations from the ancient Sumerian cuneiform that existed of her work prior until like the past 20 years were these kind of like anthropological translations of the trot. So reading the earliest attributable author of our species, a lot of the books were like stone, bone, bird, woman, cry, and now we have translations that make her sound a little bit more like what she would have sounded like to her contemporaries. But yeah, I mean, this is the text that we have, right? This is the technology that we have to apprehend both our civic station and our cosmic station is like basically here. I mean, there's the extrinsic technologies that we have in each other that language give us, and then there's the intrinsic technologies of the body, right? And it seems that, I don't know, it seems like those things have been good for a while now. It's one of those like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't know. That's not what I want to say. That's not how I wanted to land that, but here we are. Thanks, Jake. Yeah.
My
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey, what's
thank
your
you
name?
so my name's Rachel.
Rachel, it's nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you. It's a real pleasure to be in this room, and to hear everyone's thoughts in this discussion, and I had an articulation of my question, but I got so excited by the shout out to Enheduanna that it has
Hey,
flown
yeah,
from my
you're
head.
you're a fellow head.
I am, one of my friends co-curated the She Who Wrote show at the
Oh,
Morgan.
no
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
Oh,
way.
shit. Oh, that's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
cool.
so no,
Oh, that
I
rules. You're
yeah,
really
yeah,
an
no,
you're
I'm
really an head. You're like, ah, King Sargon and all this. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
no.
awesome.
So I'm gonna try to grab what the question was, but it
Yeah.
actually segued from Jake's a bit in this idea and your comment that the some of the book is about the courage to say yes to life. Because of ran out immediately and bought this book when a friend of mine recommended it to me, and all she said was, quote, "It's really about grief and death and art and poetry and finding meaning."
Mm,
And I wanted to bring up the first word here, grief.
mhm.
This hasn't really come up in the conversation yet other than obliquely, and this idea of saying yes to life. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the real existential crises that some of these characters grapple with, whether it's feeling not so psyched about being alive until meeting Layla or what have you, and sort of yeah, a little bit about the grief that comes with saying yes to being around and sort of dealing with that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. I mean, I'm 11 and a half years sober, and the idea of wanting to remain alive each day, I don't know. I mean, like I'm very much like this stuff, the stuff that we're doing here right now is like how I keep my dog in the expensive kibble. You know what I mean? Like what I actually do, what I act no, for real, like what I actually do with my life is I work in recovery community. You know what I mean? And I have newcomers with whom I work, and I'm not going to name the program of recovery that I am a part of because this is being recorded, which probably tells you the name of the program that I'm a part of. But I say that to say, like, that is what I actually do with my life, right? This stuff is cool and I really like writing and I care about writing and I care about language and I care about art. But repaying the gift that was freely given to me, which kind of miraculously also is how I keep myself alive for another day, is the thing that I built my life around, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, Azarine was speaking about Cyrus's ability to continue finding his life bewildering and surprising. My spouse is also a poet, and when we first started courting, we were living at opposite parts of the country. And so, in keeping with insufferable poet tradition, we started sending postal letters back and forth. And for months, we just sent daily postal letters and we were writing each other daily poems, which was actually this really high stakes thing we both admitted afterwards because like if you write like a C plus poem, they're gonna be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't, busy myself with falling in love with this person. But yeah, I just remember in one of their notes to me early on in one of their letters, and I don't think they'd mind my sharing this, they wrote, how lucky to realize I haven't felt everything there is to feel. And yeah, I mean, the daily reorientation towards that possibility, I think is something that literature helps me with, I think is something that, and Greek is one of those things, like part of, part of the pulverization of grief is how algorithmic it is. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes on death and dying, the Swiss psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes on death and dying in the mid 20th centuries where she offers the sort of like five terminal points of grieving from her studies on, what is it, death? I mean, denial, bargaining, depression, anger, acceptance. I messed up that order, but she names this from her clinical research in the 20th century. But like in the Penguin Anthology of Spiritual Verse, and you can Google this. I'm not like schlocking my book, but there's a poem by the Mesoamerican Nahua people, Nahua, translated by John Beerhorst in 1576, called "Midwife Addresses the Woman," and it's a midwife addressing a woman who has died in childbirth. And again, this is first translated in 1576, but certainly much, much older than that, passed down in the Nahua oral traditions. And when you read this poem, you read this, the midwife is addressing a woman who's died in childbirth, but she passes so, so cleanly and neatly through the five stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross names 500 years later in her clinical research. Like you can map them onto the poem one to one, right? Like depression, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, right? It's truly one to one. I say this to say that these algorithms, these knowledges and wisdoms are ancient. I mean, like literally ancient. Like we've been teaching them as a species since antiquity, right? We're naming them clinically and giving them fancy names like clinical psychiatry, in the past, relatively recently. But that taxonymical designation, you know, doesn't diminish the fact that it has been a part of our species' intelligence for millennia. Well, I'm offering a half millennia old example, but there are other examples too. I say this to say the inexorability of the grief algorithm is often eclipsed by the unprecedented newness of a particular experience of grief, right? When you see like yesterday, I saw a video of a father looking through the remains of human beings of the 400 people killed in Gaza yesterday, trying to find his child. And then he finds his child, right, amidst these piles of remains, right, and starts crying and praying. This is algorithmic, and it is also in more ways than one, and it is also an unprecedented articulation of a particular irreplaceable life expressing grief at a particular unprecedented irreplaceable life. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. No, I really appreciate that. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rachel. I don't know where the mic is. I don't want to be
It's over
bizarre.
here. Hi, I'm Kaylin. It's nice to meet you. Thank
Caitlin or Kaylin?
Caitlin.
Caitlin, it's nice to meet you as well.
So thank you so much for speaking with us. So I'm curious about the dreamlike scenes in Martyr where Cyrus imagines people in his life speaking to these fictional characters
Yeah.
and also to these celebrities. How did you conceive of these scenes and how do you see them contributing to the narrative as a whole and also to the characterization of Cyrus and how he perceives these people in his life?
Yeah, thank you for spending you've read the book. I appreciate that. That rules. I mean, I'm not like that's not me casting aspersions. I'm sure that many of you have read the book, but like thank you, Caitlin, for reading the book. I mean, I think dreams are fascinating. I think it's fascinating that we spend a third of our lives with our brain staging productions for us, cast by the people that we love and admire and think about. And I think it's also fascinating that we're not supposed to talk about them. You know, like the idea that people roll their eyes when you start talk. My spouse and I, when we wake up in the morning, ask each other if they dreamt because if they did, then you get to start your day with your best friend telling you a story. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm right to think dreams are interesting. I think that the idea that we're not supposed to talk about them is rooted in capitalism in ways that will make me sound strident if I try to and shrill if I try to articulate in this moment. But you just like you can't. There's no you can't put value on. You know, there's nothing valuable about a dream in terms of the market. But yeah, I mean, I'm just a bad sleeper. And so it's a game that I really did used to play when I was a kid, where I would just script conversations between a person that I missed and a person that I admired. So like Dennis Rodman talking to my aunt Shahla, what would they say to each other? You know what I mean? Like, and or whatever, you know. And I would just it was just a way to entertain my brain when I didn't have like the instant boredom exerciser in my pocket, you know. And and it became a way to get to know the character. I mean, I wrote a billion trillion of those. I'm someone who writes a lot and publishes very little, and so there are a million of those scenes where I got to know Cyrus and I got to know. And but I'm also aware, I guess, maybe from a more crafty. Are you a writer? So from a more crafty perspective, I'm aware, like I'm not ignorant of the fact that the American literary metabolism is distrustful of dreams because it's a way of sort of like getting to do lots of oracular gnomic shit in a kind of stakesless way. And so it's like it's one of those things where when you talk about dreams in fiction, you're supposed to talk about like, you know, taking inspiration from Kafka or Marquez or something. But actually, I was watching a lot of The Sopranos, and the in The Sopranos, it's a piece of narrative art that uses dream really, really intelligently because the way that they get you invested in dream is by peppering the dreams with narrative revelation. So, for instance, and this is a Sopranos spoiler, so if you have not seen The Sopranos, feel free to cover your ears if you're sensitive to that. But in The Sopranos, there's a character named Big Pussy who begins ratting on Tony, and Tony realizes, and he's aware that there's a rat, and he's trying to figure out who the rat is, and he realizes in a dream when a fish in a fish market tells him that Big Pussy is the rat, and then he acts on that in his living and he's right. You know, Big Pussy really was the rat, right? And so it gets you engaged in the dream in a narrative way, in a way that is actually not discrete from the plot. And so I stole that. Every dream in the book has some sort of breadcrumbs, has some narrative stuff happening. You know, there are central mysteries. If you've read the book, you're aware that there are some central mysteries in the book that begin to unravel or reveal themselves as the book progresses. And in each dream, there is Cyrus's unconscious going out a little bit further than his conscious mind and unraveling those mysteries, which is a fun game to play and consciously or unconsciously sort of communicates to the reader that the dreams actually have stakes and that there is narrative data to be revealed in the dreams and they're not just, you know, modular skippable chapters. Hey, take care, friends.
Hi, my name is Gabriel. Over here.
Oh, hey, Gabriel. I like your name very much.
Thank you. Thank
It's a
you.
good name.
Thanks very much. So, forgive me if this is quite a simplistic question, but I'm very struck by in the title of your book, the exclamation point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate on why you chose to put that there. I mean, the
Sure.
kind of thing that comes to mind is it sounds like something someone is saying, an
Sure.
exclamation, perhaps an accusation or a commendation.
A
I would just wonder,
commendation.
I don't know.
That's
So yeah,
funny.
could you elaborate a little bit on
Yeah,
what
yeah,
that
yeah,
signifies? And
yeah.
I'm only halfway through the book, so
I
if the
won't
answer's on
spoil
page
anything.
200, I
I
apologize.
won't spoil anything. No, I mean, the books are non-perishable. That's what's so cool about them. But there's no rush. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can go in order of, like, hoity-toityness. One and I'll start with least. One, I thought it would be a funny provocation to have a book called Martyr with an exclamation point and my very ethnic name underneath it, sold in airports. I thought that that was just funny in a kind of snotty way. Two, I think it communicates something about tone. I think that if the book had just been called Martyr without that, it would have seemed sort of dour or self-serious or self-important or relentless, like one of those vegetable books that you know you're supposed to read because you'll be glad to be able to say that you read it, but it will be the kind of joyless slog through an endless litany of trauma, right? And it's not for me to say whether or not that's what I've written, but I hope that that's not what I've written, and I hope that the exclamation point maybe communicates that where there is grief in the book, it is made wise by having known profound joy, and where there is joy in the book, it is made complex by having known profound grief. And then the hoity-toityest valence is that I think of a martyr's death as being fairly sudden and staccato and loud. It is a big way to retroactively cast meaning over a person's entire life, which moves in opposition to the way that most of us create meaning in our lives, which is to say the quotidian sort of feeding of the baby or the grading of the paper or the calling of the mother, et cetera, and with the hopes that, at the end of a life, stacking each of those much more granular, less sort of staccato, flashy, grains of sand on the pile. It's sort of like a rolling ellipses of meaning versus the big staccato exclamation. Mhm.
Thank you very much. My
Hey,
name is Alejandro. I am an assistant professor here in economics.
what's your name?
Alejandro,
Alejandro, it's nice to meet you. An
nice to meet you
economics
too.
professor. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
so I come from a very different
Yeah, 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 it's wild.
world,
It's wild.
but
We
I
meet
enjoyed.
we meet in statistics. I'm interested in casualty statistics and the creating of narrative to somaticize casualty statistics, and you do other stuff with statistics.
Yeah, we could discuss
Yeah,
statistics if you
yeah,
want
yeah, yeah, yeah.
as well. But look, I enjoyed your book tremendously. It was given to me as a gift by my uncle-in-law, and it was really wonderful to read. So, but I'm a bit boring to this setting of participation. But I guess
Same.
my question is, he seems to Kurush, he seems to have to mourn his mother, and I guess in a very profound way, he wants to find meaning in his own death as a way of making up for the fact that his mother's death didn't have any apparent
Mhm.
meaning.
Yeah, yeah.
And but to me, there's a shift in the at some point in the book, which is when he finds out what he does
Spoilers.
about Orchidea, right? No spoilers. Uh, Okay, okay, okay.
Yeah, I got you. I got
Okay,
you.
yeah.
I'm picking up what you're putting down.
So at, wh- at at which point his grief really, if you think about it from an objective perspective, has less sense as an objective grief and more it becomes more of a sort of a self-absorbed experience that really didn't make contact with what happened,
I I
uh,
I I hear what you're saying.
right? And
Uh-huh.
so I found like at the end of the book, I couldn't find enough reflection on that. To me,
Mhm.
the grief that was spoken about, that was really the most substantial grief in the whole story, was the grief of his father,
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah, totally.
because his was very real
Yeah,
grief,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
his was a very real story, and I was wondering about that. Like, what do you make about sort of the aspect of grief, which is just a self-absorbed sort of way of experiencing his own living versus the actual grief that he ought to be feeling about something which one might understand as more objective. And sorry for the prosaic use of words here.
No, 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 no,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
it's this is a thank you for your question, Alejandro. Yeah, it's a new phenomenon for me too, to be talking about writing in ways that risk spoiler, right? Like, no one cares if I'm like, "The last word in this poem is bird," or you know what I mean? Like, but yeah, so the just talking, and I'm also a petulant toddler about spoilers, like, I'm such a baby about them, but luckily I've read my book, so, yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful question. I think that the way that I can talk about it without putting my thumb on the scale is to say that what Cyrus's grief metamorphosizes, that's not how you say that word, into by the end of the book, with the various and sundry discoveries and things that he learns over the course of the book and the things that are made available to him, becomes this big eclipsing thing that makes moot the attempt to even gesture towards trying to wrap language around it, right? So there's the quote earlier in the book, and I think I was talking to the class with whom I met earlier about this. Brian Eno, the musician, has this not very good book called A Year with Swollen Appendices, but in it he has this great quote where he's talking about listening to blues singers on records. And he says that listening to their voice crack on a record, like hitting a note that the vinyl can't capture faithfully, or hitting a note that the vinyl has like warped and is no longer able to record, is, and this is the quote, the sound of witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. The sound of witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. And my sense of the book is that in that final chapter of the book, not the coda, but the book's final chapter, Cyrus's experience of the world becomes that emotional event too momentous for the medium assigned to record it, right? And instead of it just being grief, it's a lot of things, right? Including pride and anger and when it becomes too momentous for the medium assigned to record it, it becomes incumbent upon the artist, who is me in this sort of meta way, to show the fracturing of the medium in some capacity. And so the world starts melting, right?
I think we have one last question and then
Cool.
we want to do book signing.
Cool. Cool. Hey, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Jane,
Hey,
and
Jane.
I wanted to ask about something that I don't think we've touched on very much. But it was one of my favorite aspects of the book, and that's the aspects of humor in the book. Because we've talked a lot about the very like deep aspects and the trauma and everything. But I mean, Cyrus is clearly a very funny character, and you've made the room laugh a couple times, so I'd say you're pretty funny. And for me, I've always seen people talk about humor as a way to like ignore serious things and kind of a dichotomy of things
Yeah.
being funny and things
Yeah.
being serious.
Yeah.
And I think this is maybe my favorite book I've ever read that kind of ties those
Oh,
together without
it's
making
a
that
big thing to say to a person.
a dichotomy.
Thank you.
So I'm interested in kind of how you balance that as you were writing and kind of yeah how you view the humor interacting with the more serious themes of
Yeah,
the book.
thank you for saying that. That's really, really generous, and I appreciate you reading it. Mm, mm. Time is your most irreplenishable resource. You're never gonna get more time. You can get more money, you can get more friends, you can get more but you're never gonna get more time. You have X number of minutes that you get to be alive on the planet Earth, and then, you know, you hit Y, right? And so the idea that you're sitting down and giving me 10 hours of your life in reading this book is truly, truly, truly a profound gift, like a gift of the highest order, right? And we're also alive and speaking to each other in a moment where the opportunity cost of reading has never been greater, right? Like instead of reading my book, you could have been reading literally any other book. You could have been watching almost anything ever, any TV show or movie ever made. You could have been learning how to tango on YouTube. For real, you could have been learning Esperanto on Duolingo. You could have been learning how to julienne an onion. Like the opportunity cost of reading a novel for 10 hours has never been greater in the history of our species, right? And so the gift that you've given me in reading it has never been greater. And I do believe that that makes incumbent on me some commensurate. I don't know. I mean, like, it makes me very, very reverent of your time, right? It makes me very, very respectful of the gift of your time, right? And not wasting it. Horace, the poet Horace said, "Dulce et util," that's sweet and useful. Is it what? Dulce, yeah, sweet and useful. Yeah, like you want to. I don't know. It's often translated as delight and instruct, but then I got self-conscious because my friend Kayla is a classicist, and so I was like, and it's not literally delight and instruct, but it's often translated as but sweet and useful, whatever. But he said that writing should be sweet and useful, right? Which is often translated as delight and instruct. And I think about the idea, like if I was just trying to persuade you that my worldview is the correct worldview, I could just shout at you or make an Instagram post about it, you know what I mean? For real. And like some people need to be shouted at, you know what I mean? I'm not saying that, but like that's not what I go to novels for, right? And if you are giving me the gift of 10 hours of your most irreplenishable resource, right? Like I want to give you the gift of delight and instruction or sweetness and utility. And I think that because of the perceived urgency of our times and the perceived unprecedentedness of our moment, a lot of writers are and artists writ large are galloping very, very quickly into instruction, right? Which again is understandable, but it has, at its zenith has the effect of, the person shouting at you from a bullhorn on the sidewalk, right? Like, you tune it out, right? I think part of the way that the novel works is that it gains purchase to your interiority through a measure of delight. And then, once it has that, offers the measure of instruction, right? And that seems to me a pretty sacred compact made between the reader and the writer, right? The comedian Richard Pryor sort of paraphrases Horace when he says that he wants to get you laughing so your mouth will be open when he pours the poison down, right? But yeah, I mean that idea, dulce et util, I can't improve upon that. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Are you okay with just saying some
Yeah, yeah,
words?
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Where do
we
you want me
have
to be?
books for sale in the back. I know a lot of you have your copies. If you would like Kaveh to sign that, please feel free to come up.